So this is a quick presentation to walk you through a little bit more specifics about academic language. So you should have watched the video with Dr. Cannon explaining academic language and language demands. And what we're going to do in this presentation is just go through a little bit more specifics related to mathematics instruction. So again, this is just review of what EdTPA calls the cycle of effective teaching. So we start with planning, we move to instruction and assessment, and notice in the graphic that what encompasses all of those things is this idea of academic language. So it's something important that we need to pay attention to, not only with our lesson planning, but also during instruction and how we assess our students. So the first thing I want you to do is to download your particular EdTPA handbook, either the high school or middle school from Moodle. Go to the glossary and make note of how academic language is defined. And then conduct a search of the document for academic language and language demands. So some keywords that you might search for are vocabulary, language function, syntax, discourse, mathematical precision. So I want you to pause the video and go ahead and do that. And then I'll have a quick reflection question for you to complete. So we define academic language as students' oral and written language used to deepen content understanding. There are 5 components of academic language that we call language demands. We have the language function, vocabulary, key phrases and symbols, mathematical precision, discourse, and syntax. The first 3 are underlined because those are language demands that EdTPA is going to look for within every unit, okay? Discourse and syntax is you're gonna choose one of those. So when you think about a learning segment or a sequence of lessons, for that learning segment, you're always going to include a language function, vocabulary, key phrases and symbols, and mathematical precision. And then you're going to want to consider whether you're going to focus on discourse or syntax, depending on the content. So what we're going to do next is look at examples of all of these so you can understand more clearly what they are. First is the language function. And the language function is essentially a verb related to the topic of a particular lesson or sequence of lessons or unit that is closely aligned with the learning objective. Excuse me. EdTPA handbook has a complete list, but here are some that are very common in math classrooms. Explain, describe, justify, prove, compare, identify, analyze, or represent. All of those are examples of a language function. And again, it's something that's closely aligned with the learning objectives. So for example, if the learning objective is students will be able to describe the solution to a system of equations as the values of X and Y that satisfy both equations. If that's my learning goal, then it would make sense that my language function is describe, because that's a language activity that I want students to be able to do in this particular lesson. As another example, students will be able to identify transformations to the parent function y equals 2 to the x. Again, if that's my learning goal, then an appropriate language function might be identify. Now, that's not to say that your learning goal is always going to contain the language function. It could be that the language function is a word that's associated with the learning goal, not necessarily the same verb that's in the learning goal. And we'll look at some more examples of that later on. Next, we have vocabulary, key phrases, and symbols. So obviously definitions are important. So for every, again, sequence of lessons, it's really important to consider what math vocabulary are students using and to have those words clearly defined. Key phrases, for example, the solution to the equation is the value of X that makes the equation a true mathematical statement. If that's a phrase that you're using over and over in a particular sequence of lessons, then you're going to want to include that with your vocabulary. And then finally, symbols. This is really important in mathematics, right? So some examples would be like summation notation, function notation, or a particular notation that we use when we talk about geometry relationships. So it's really important to think about the symbols that are going along with the key phrases and definitions that you're using in your lessons. Next, we have mathematical precision. The easiest way to think about mathematical precision is that you're using clear definitions. When we're talking about specific symbols, that we're stating the meaning of those symbols. Specifying units of measure is an example of mathematical precision, as well as labeling the coordinate plane or parts of a diagram. All of those are examples of mathematical precision. Next, we have syntax. So syntax is the conventions for organizing words, phrases, and symbols within mathematics. So some examples, if we think about the word table. So table in mathematics has a very different meaning than, say, a table in everyday life, right? You're sitting at a table with chairs, whereas in mathematics, a table is a way for us to organize mathematical information. And the ways that we construct a table are very specific. So that's an example of syntax. Some other examples, the ways that we talk about the Cartesian coordinate system, understanding the x-axis as independent variable and the y-axis as the dependent variable, understanding what a point represents, right? That we always write the x-coordinate first and then the y-coordinate. And then the ways that we use dotted or solid lines, or a solid point, or a closed circle or open circle. All of those are examples of syntax. And finally, discourse. So discourse is the discipline-specific structures and ways of participating, constructing, and communicating understanding. So it's really important when we talk about discourse that it's more than just students talking to each other, okay? In mathematics, there's ways that we communicate that's very specific. So for example, the way that we prove statements in mathematics, we have a really particular way that we do that. One example is a two-column proof. That's an example of discourse. It's not necessarily verbal, but written. That's still an example of discourse. The ways that we interpret graphical representations is also an example of discourse, and the ways that we make and support conjectures. And I think in the video that you watched, Dr. Cannon gave the example of a turn and talk, right? So a turn and talk is a move that you might use that provide your students with an opportunity to practice discourse, right? Where they might be explaining their thinking, or they might be making a conjecture. All of those are examples of discourse. So what we need to practice then is, once we have learning goals for a particular lesson, how do we then identify all of the language demands that are associated with that particular learning goal or a sequence of lessons? So that's what we're going to practice next. So I have here on the slide 2 learning goals for a particular sequence of lessons. Students will be able to represent binomial multiplication using an area model. And students will be able to multiply 2 linear binomials using algebra tiles and the box method. So the first thing I would like for you to do is to think about what language function might be appropriate for these 2 learning goals. And then I want you to brainstorm vocabulary, mathematical precision, syntax, and discourse that might occur around these 2 particular learning goals. So you'll have a question where you'll enter your ideas in, and then we'll talk about this when we meet in class next week and look at some more examples. Dr. Cannon has a lot of great academic language supports on the EdTPA website. And what's important for you to think about now, moving forward, in every lesson, you should include your language function, vocabulary and symbols, mathematical precision, and then either discourse and/or syntax. It's also going to be important to think about what are you doing to support your students' use of academic language. And that's going to be the focus of our class next week. We'll talk about that when we see each other next week. Have a good one.